So today we're going to cover the second essay of Jonas's book, The Phenomenon of Life, which is titled Philosophical Aspects of Darwinism. So I kind of tried to capture what each subchapter was about, but it was kind of difficult for me to discern what were like the few key elements of each subchapter. So this is just like what I found interesting and perhaps relevant. Right. Okay. So wait, I'm just gonna do this. The first subchapter kind of deals with structure versus origin. So Jonas starts with the fact that the mechanistic model of nature of the 17th century was primarily concerned with existing structures. So either like solar system, organism, whatever structure as it was found. And it was understood as a functioning mechanism, which is to be explained by decomposing it into elementary components of matter and motion, or in other words, to explain it in general principles of mechanics. Now, so the question of how this structure came to be in some past history, so its genesis was kind of bracketed and temporarily avoided because it was considered fraught with teleological dangers. And even later, as the sciences matured a bit, in the 18th century, deism was kind of compatible still with scientific cosmology. So even if we understand the world as a sort of a mechanistic clock, we can still say, okay, we just have to account for the beginning, and this beginning, who said this mechanic clock can be imagined as a creator, and we only need to account for it once. Sorry. So basically, Jonas kind of separates a functioning of a given system from the generation of this system. And an example in the physical sciences would be Newton's theory of the solar system versus the Kant-Laplace-Nebular hypothesis of the origination of this system. And the point of modern physics is that it tries to answer both of these two questions, employing the same principles. So the producing reality is the same as the product, just differently located in the time series of cause and effect. And so traditional theories of origin kind of assumed a superiority of the originating principle over its effect. So they had more power, more perfection, more reality than their effect or consequence. Whereas in this modern mechanical theory of origin, this cause is inferior to the effect, at least in terms of structural articulation. So then we get to the second subchapter. So the living kingdom at first kind of defies the application of this new mechanical conception of origin. And Jonas kind of states that evolution finally succeeded in subjugating it in this respect to the general scheme. So what was this difficulty? The difficulty was how to account for the construction of the immense complexity of living beings, which Jonas contrasts with the majestically crude cosmic structure. So organisms, even like the typical example of the eye, just simple organs of organisms are immensely complex, far exceeding anything humans have ever come up with. And partially, this problem is complicated more since the first conception of evolution was seen as development, or at least what we would now consider development. So how the structure, this given structure of an organism unfolds or develops from germ to adult in each generation, where the plan is kind of given and it just unfolds. And this idea of evolution as development kind of presupposes species as a existing category. So, and if species are fixed, so there are some kind of immutable essences, we have to kind of account for the separate origins of each of them, and that is it's impossible to think that that could happen by chance. So that kind of eluded um, um, the application of this mechanical conception of origin to life. And so part of the solution was to extend the meaning of evolution, not only as the evolution of how the pre-given plan evolves, but how the plan itself evolved. So it's, Jonas says, the extension of the question of origin to the permanently self-repeating plans of growth themselves. And this entails that first representatives no longer had to be representatives of existing patterns. These patterns were regarded as temporal outcomes and not timeless determinants of the life process. And if living forms are descendants from one another and have not risen independently, the probability problem kind of splits into two. So you have to account for the spontaneous generation of the first forms, and chance combination seems plausible enough if we can imagine a mechanism that's simple enough. So this is an ongoing debate in molecular biology, whether this was some kind of replication machine, metabolic membrane. So it's an ongoing empirical question. And the second step is descent from the present ones. And this can be then thought of as a quasi-mechanical picture of an unplanned, undirected, yet progressive sequence whose beginnings foreshadow nothing of the outcome. And this sort of splitting the problem overcomes this monstrous improbability embodied in this initial conceptualization where we had some fixed species and they would supposed to magically sprung up from nowhere. Importantly, the dynamics must not contain any element of teleology or performative disposition or aspiration toward any higher forms to come. Jonas says, if this is to be a scientific doctrine. So basically, the conception of the emergence of life is kind of reconceptualized in these small steps where you have first like these dice represent like Jonas actually uses this term, but it's like a throwing of the dice where matter is spontaneously organized into the first life form, and then this life form gets slightly modified with continuous mutation, and so we get this giant tree of life, which you're probably all familiar with, where you get from cumulative functioning of mutation through heredity, and these small steps of chance allows to the life to grow into these vast and complex patterns that at first seem like impossible to explain. And in this case, in this story, natural selection kind of fills the place of the directing principle vacated by teleology. As Jonas says, evolution with its combination of chance variation and natural selection completed the extrusion of teleology from nature. Purpose becomes redundant in life and retires wholly into subjectivity. Now we get to the third part, which I kind of focused on the concept of liquidation of immutable essences, which is kind of a continuation of the previous chapter. So Descartes' conception of animal nature was that it's some kind of a definite mechanical structure that unilaterally determines the function of that structure, which is the life of the organism. And since it unilaterally determines it, the analysis of the structure tells us everything there is to a living being. Evolutionism kind of asks how this given type of structure is itself produced, and that it has to be itself produced by life. And the outcome and temporary, it's only the outcome and temporary stopping place of a continuous dynamism, which itself must be termed life. And Jonas said that this kind of means that this sort of reconceptualization completes the liquidation of immutable essences and kind of is a sign of the victory of nominalism over realism. And he termed this as a major philosophical event, which powerfully confirms the anti-Platonism of the modern mind, with its absence of any teleological directness. And he states that the evolutionary process presents itself as a sheer adventure with an entirely unforeseeable course. Essence is even in physical science substituted by conditions as the originating principle, and in the life sciences this means these conditions are the environment, and organism is primarily determined by the conditions of its existence in this organism environment situation, which is kind of like a dipole. Living in this conception is the behavior induced by this dipolar system, so organism and environment, in one of its poles. So basically, the whole of organism and environment induces life in the pole of organism. Life is understood in terms of the organism and environment situation rather than in terms of an exercise of an autonomous nature. And this statement regarding the autonomous nature of organisms will repeat later, and I think it might be an interesting entry into a discussion later on. So typical patterns of living are just relative stability and specifics of behavior in any given species, and they are the equilibrium achieved between the two factors, organism and environment. And typical organic structures are the equilibrium relative to the long-term generic situation. We will skip this for now. And just the final thing that this chapter provides is a sort of like, so 19th century evolutionism is for Jonas kind of an ancestor of existentialism, since the denial of essence leads to nothingness, and man suddenly doesn't have an ideal nature, which was posited before in Stoics and in Christian philosophy as a homo animal rational, or man in God's image. And reason then is reduced to a means among means to be judged by the efficiency of its instrumental role in the survival issue. And this is sort of, Jonas sees this as a way of Darwinianism and evolutionism kind of leading towards nihilism. So reason is just a means to an end, and this then develops into nihilism. So the fourth chapter, we get into the question of necessity and contingency. So since the Copernican revolution, natural necessity and radical contingency are considered universal phenomena of the whole res extensa, and evolutionism kind of extends this notion to the realm of life. And it does so, this should be 1, 2, 3, but it's 1, 1, 1. It does so by all the three things that we have sort of mentioned up until now. So higher structures emerge from more primitive ones accidentally, so by the agency of entirely primitive forces. This is the reversal of the old belief in the superior status of origins. Organic structure, the condition of each function, and itself the function of a vital dynamic. This is the reversal of the traditional relation assumed between pre-existing structure and function. And lastly, the external conditions as the chief agency of evolution contra autonomous achievement of the living substance. Adaptation here is understood, so there is no performance on the side of life. Adaptation is simply a dynamic equilibrium. And again, this might be later on discussed during the discussion, since autonomy plays a really big role in, for instance, an activism. He goes on to discuss the distribution of causality between these two factors, the organism and environment. So organism provides chance variation on which natural selection is then sort of exercised. And the question is, what is the share of each of these two causes? And according to Jonas, natural selection takes the place of teleology. It decides on the merit of the random material offered to it. And it does this by the favor of progress in certain direction. But this is a negative substitute for teleology, since it favors by elimination, it suppresses but does not create. So here, chance variation has this positive role, the emergence of form. And another quote from the book is, so evolution kind of works as advance through mischance or ascent by accident. So, and what does this hypothesis imply? Jonas says that stability or faithful transmission is an essential virtue of life, although this could be debated since there are mechanisms that promote instability in living organisms. And mutation is just a disturbance of this stability. And so basically, a mutation is just a mechanical mishap. It's a deviation from the norm, and it's by definition pathological. And so we can interpret the higher organization of any animal or man as a gigantic monstrosity into which the original amoeba has grown through a long history of disease. And any higher form is nothing but a sport by itself, indistinguishable from a lower form. It just has differential survival value. And also we can kind of see a new dualism in the midst of this materialist realm, a Cartesian model of kind of two non-communicating substances, not of organism environment, but of germ soma. So germs are the the cells that carry the hereditary information, and the soma, which is the body cells. So soma, the actual organism, is itself part of the environment, the immediate environment for the germ, and the mediator of the effect on the later's existence by the wider environment. But these effects have, as far as conducted through the life history of the soma, so the development, do not include and reflects of the organism's experience and achievements in the lifelong dealings with the environment. I have a longer quote somewhere here, but I'm going to maybe invoke it if we have time. Okay, so the fifth and the final subchapter kind of deals, I discern this main topic is how materialism kind of overcomes itself in evolution. So there is a strong metaphysical importance of Darwinism, which credits automatism of material nature with the generation and the branching of seeding life forms. But now matter has to account for the origin of mind in addition to the physical organizations themselves. So in Descartes' theory of animal bodies are basically machines, and pleasure and pain in animals is just a deceptive appearance. Jonas says animals are nothing but bodies. And this inwardedness, as we saw in the first essay, is confined solely to man and leaves everything else up for mechanical analysis. But evolution abolishes this special position of man by the principle of continuous graduation. So there is a continuity of descent, and there are degrees of structure that evolve. And so this kind of implies also a continuity of inwardness, degrees of awareness. And Jonas says that it doesn't make sense to draw a line of inwardness anywhere else than the beginning of life, which we can discuss later. So if inwardness is coextensive with life, purely mechanistic account of life will also not be sufficient, since subjective phenomena defy quantification. So in a way, for Jonas, evolution kind of returns some dignity back to the realm of life, and endows it or posits that it has a certain inwardness that it was previously denied for it in the classical Cartesian dualism. Okay, so and then there's the appendix, which is titled "The Meaning of Cartesianism for the Theory of Life." So Jonas first distinguishes that, okay, we have kind of two modes of life here we're talking about. One is life as res extensa, and this can be kind of explained through evolution. And then we have life as res cogitans. And how do we explain that? What does evolution has to do with this? And he states that even for Descartes, life is just a fact of physics alone, so just a structural behavioral phenomena. And soul, consciousness, feeling, desiring, perceiving thought is a fact of man alone. And so there are two riddles connected with this. The first is the riddle of practical experience. So our whole experience kind of contradicts denying organic reality a striving of its own for existence and fulfillment. To quote, how an act of will can move a limb, since limb as a part of the extended world can only be moved by another body's imparting its antecedent motion to it. So theory kind of invalidates our primary experience that we have this will to move the body, but it does not yet explain it. And the other riddle that Jonas mentions is the riddle of degrees of organization. So this new doctrine provided only the connection between organization and observable behavior, or organic function, but leaves out the quality of life supported by it. Or since we previously, in the previous slide, I talked about this sort of continuity of inwardness. So this new doctrine of evolution kind of provides the connection between organization and observable behavior, but this does not kind of explain or does not try to explain the qualitative aspects of life. And this is kind of what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella, for a very comprehensive overview of this chapter, which is like most chapters here, sort of intertwined with all of the arguments he's developing. Okay, so has anyone got any questions, comments? Who would like to start?
Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, maybe I can start by saying I have a bunch of different comments. Mainly my reflections while reading the text were on linking it to today's understanding, because this text is already, what, like 60, 70 years old? Like, how much does it still stand today? So this is maybe an easy question to begin with. The distinction he makes between this new duality of soma and what is it called, the germ-soma duality. Would you say that modern epigenetics has sort of undermined that conception and has remedied it? Would you say that in today's world that duality doesn't stand anymore? What are like the thoughts on that?
I think, I mean, epigenetics is still kind of under researched, but I mean, so basically epigenetics means that part of the genetic information is stored not in the genes themselves, but like in some aspects of the genome, which can be changed during the development or the soma, right? And then can be kind of changed in the germline and kind of transmitted onto the next generation, right? So it's kind of going for a sort of Lamarckism where behavior of the organism kind of actually affects the next generation, genetically speaking. And sure, there are, I guess, some studies, at least in mice, where and some well-known mechanisms how that can happen. But I think we still don't know a large amount of this interaction between environment, organism, and how it is how the traits are then passed on to the next generation.
I'd just like to add in here that I'm not that familiar with the empirical work that's being done there. I know there's a lot of it. It's a fascinating field, but unfortunately, my understanding doesn't really go beyond a few lectures and podcasts. So that's sort of a preface for anything I might say on the topic. But even though there are plenty of fascinating observations, like one of them, I hope I'm getting this right, an experiment on nematodes, or basically a kind of worms which are fairly primitive. So the researchers conditioned the worms to avoid a specific stimulus and then ground them up, fed them to other worms of the same species, and the other worms had the same conditioned response. So that's one example of something that's I don't know how well people can wrap their heads around it, or how to what extent the contemporary conceptual frame of biology is sort of well suited for something like that. But in any case, even though there are very fascinating empirical observations on this, and it's known that the dualism isn't that simple, I'd say that still the conceptual scheme isn't really keeping up. So I'd say that, to me, as again, someone very much from outside that field, it does seem that it's sort of like trying to maintain Cartesian dualism by some kind of Malebranchian theory or whatever. It seems like it's very hard to uphold that very sort of textbook, sort of high school level view of genetics and evolutionary inheritance. So yeah, there seems to be some kind of a discord here. I don't know what will come out of it, but hopefully there's someone better informed than I am on on this question. Atul, I think you are muted still.
Yeah, I was just saying, as far as I can tell, the later work is kind of blurring the distinction between the two. It's not so rigid anymore between the germline and the body that bears the germline.
I know of, so there's this specific kind of direction of biology, which is called evolutionary development biology, which kind of combines the two and basically tries to show how development is influenced by evolutionary changes and the likes, and a lot of work there is showing, for instance, that also this kind of naive conception of the genome just being comprised of genes is not accurate with today's knowledge, and you have a lot of regulatory mechanisms that are also coded in the genome, and so evolution, for instance, can also affect those mechanisms without changing the actual proteins themselves, and in this way it can kind of regulate the expression of genes. at different times and in different scales, right? So I think what biologists are just figuring out is that everything is way more complex than like this original image kind of posited.
I think if anything, it will be more in line with what Jonas is talking about here. If we don't have genes, they're sort of very simple Legos that sort of encode all of the information, then it's, I don't know, I'd say from a theoretical point of view, he would probably be happy to see that development, to put it that way. Atul, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm open to also other questions. Otherwise, I have like 2 other notes down. Feel free to add other questions in between. In the meanwhile, I can maybe read one of them, see what you think. So this was about the point on autonomous systems. So that you already raised this point for discussion, right? Like in an active theory, there's this idea of autonomy has much importance. So Jonas says that in this evolutionary picture, there's 2 domains of causality. One is mutations on the side of the organism, and the other is natural selection on the side of the environment. I felt like that distinction was already a bit crude because he already mentions that the mutations involve, for example, radiation from the environment. So it seems like on the side of mutations, there is already a sort of a organism-environment interaction. And on the side of natural selection, I guess if we introduce the notion of autonomy of the organism, it's no longer just the environment that is sort of forcing its natural selection onto the organism, but there's also more of a dialectic there. And I'm curious what you think about how the notion of autonomy as an activism introduces it, how it disturbs this evolutionary conception. Like, yeah, what does the idea of autonomy really add? And as far as I can tell, autonomy means something like a circular causality, a self-organizing circular causal system. Yeah, do you feel like this changes the conception or not? Maybe a bit much there, but maybe it makes you think of something.
I kind of wanted Timothy to kind of intervene in the whole autonomy adaptation debate, since he kind of wrote about it. But I think autonomy, even in an activism, is kind of understood like in this 0-1 distinction, where either an organism is autonomous and alive, or it isn't an organism and it's not alive. And so you have to kind of, if you want some kind of graduation there, you have to introduce other concepts. But I have to think a bit more about what your question was first.
Timothy, we can't hear you.
No?
Now we can.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm not really sure whether I can add to this, but the notion, I mean, I didn't really see the notion of autonomy connected to this problem of the relationship between the organism and the environment. But I do see the connection. I mean, the way an activist speak about what's the notion, like they have a specific understanding of natural selection or like the process of evolution. There's
natural
a term
drift.
there. Sorry,
natural drift in Maturana at least, and
yeah, exactly. So that's the idea that basically, I mean, it's like by now I think it's like a widely held idea that there's like this circular causality working between the organism and the environment. So the organism is kind of an agent that transfigures its environment according to its needs. So you have like this dual process of evolving, which involves also, of course, the adaptation of the organism to the environment, but also like an active construction of a niche of an organism. So there's like this. So the direction of the process of evolution involves like this kind of a two-way kind of interaction. And then also about the notion of autonomy, I had some Oh yeah, yeah. This is just a thought I had. I mean, it's kind of related to what we've been talking, but like this distinction between the soma and the germ seems kind of it's crude to me, because if you had just like a germ, like a passive kind of let's say a vessel for the genetic material, then you still couldn't explain the process of evolution, because the evolution that doesn't just act on anything. Like you don't have rocks do not evolve. Like they are incapable of being subject of evolution, right? In the same way that beings are. So if you just had like genetic material floating around in some sort of like an in vitro situation, you don't have the evolutionary selection process going on, right? It's just the material that just floats around, doesn't do anything, right? So you have to have some sort of autonomous adaptive system, like wrapped around the genetic material, so to say, in order to have some sort of a system that is apt to be something that is apt to be acted upon by the process of natural selection. Also, of course, you have to introduce the notion of like reproduction or something. Like, of course, it has to be a self-reproducing system in order to be the kind of thing that you could select variations from, like a given population. So that was just a thought, maybe, to contribute to the discussion.
Regarding natural drift, I remember reading that in the Tree of Knowledge, and I don't know why, but it's one of those things that sort of I don't think I got a terribly good grip on it. I have no idea why. Maybe it's not sort of the primary thing that I'm interested in that book or in Varela's thought in general, but it's I do know that he very staunchly criticizes the concept of adaptation, the sort of typical adaptationist view, but I don't really know that much in terms of the sort of positive import of that. If anyone has any a better grasp of natural drift, that might be useful.
Yeah, my grasp of it is exhausted in the brief notes that I've given. So maybe someone else.
The way I read it is basically the same point which Jonas is implying here, that we can't look at evolution in this fixed manner of having a finished state of an organism that is just subjected to the environment, and that's basically the end of the story. But it's more of like an it's more of a dynamic relationship. I think it actually makes kind of a similar Maturana and Varela make a similar analogy to Jonas' gambling. I think they have something like someone is flicking droplets of water or something like that from a hill, but then everything isn't determined from just the droplets nor just the environment, but how the two interact, how the wind blows, and what particular state the droplets find themselves before being flicked and so forth. So yeah, it's basically this dynamic relationship, dynamic view of evolution. We can't really predict how things are going to evolve just from having the environment and the organism as two separate things, but have to take into account how they both change through time and how they structurally couple in all these given points of time. And it's also a criticism of, I think, the same evolutionist view that Jonas is criticizing here, or just describing at this point.
Really interesting. So maybe at this point we can kind of like broaden the discussion towards this general theme of teleology throughout the paper, because that for me was like kind of the heart of the matter here. Like on the one hand, we started off in more ancient times with like a transcendent teleology or some ideal unity that is inherent to our spirits. And then with evolutionism, there's a reversal to the complete opposite, where everything is determined by an absolute causal necessity and life is a sort of complete contingency. So in between these two, there seems to be a need to kind of wedge, find a way between these two. And that has to do with the lived experience, right? It has to do with the living itself happening and the form of teleology that manifests there. I find some of Merleau-Ponty's writings on this really useful. He speaks of not a finality, but a heavy finality. So the teleology that's there in life is not ideal, pure finality, but a heavy or a weighted finality. Or he also uses the expression a trembling of the whole. So sort of there is a whole, but it's precarious and it's shaking and it can disintegrate at every moment, but it does form into a whole. So I find these notions seem to get into this middle ground that describes the sort of purpose that we actually live, which isn't a sort of guaranteed destiny. It isn't a meaningless randomness, but this realm in between. So I wonder what if any of your reflections went in this direction of like trying to get to what this middle ground is, this reconception of teleology.
Maybe I would add to this question like kind of a sub question, because this is what my issue, or like thing I was asking myself when reading this, was that Jonas seems to, I mean, he uses the notion of teleology, and he kind of, a lot of places, I mean, it's many times he implicitly connects the notion with interiority. So in this yeah, like the vital. So I was just wondering, what's the connection between these two concepts? I mean, like specifically, like I was wondering whether, like, so if we're familiar with the enactivist notion of autonomy and the way they like use it to sort of naturalize normativity, or let's say teleology, then yeah, so this is just a notion that yeah, we have some sort of like a circular causality in this. I mean, you could sort of simplify it down to a kind of a homeostatic process, like you have some sort of self-regulation going on, and it's, so the argument goes like this is there's some sort of intrinsic teleology or normativity going on here, because you have a system that kind of regulates itself, and so it has to sort of at least implicitly like measure a kind of preferred state and kind of be able to enact like some sort of move into the direction of its preferred state of being, right? So then my question would be like, is this enough for Jonas? Is this this is good because it can still be kind of it doesn't really require any sort of lived experience aspect to it. At least I would see it that way. And Jonas's interiority, I think, necessarily like implies some sort of a lived aspect, and also a kind of understanding of your own purposes that maybe the enactivist notion doesn't really capture, like a sort of a understanding of your own goals or your own desires or something like that. So maybe that would be the sub question to your yeah. So yeah, that would be my
I would have another question, I guess, related to that. Not any answers, but another question that I found very intriguing, because in this chapter, Jonas seems to criticize the idea that the only purpose of life would be the self-preservation. Like mechanicism tried to preserve as the essence of life only this aspect, the self-preservation. And sometimes I have the impression that in enactivism, at least in some branches of enactivism, the same happens. Like autonomy is defined by this homeostatic purpose of self-preservation. And I had the impression that Jonas was criticizing that, like life would have more than just self-preservation. And I think this might be connected to the teleologic question.
Yeah, here I'd say that I when it comes to the enactivists, well, depends on who we are talking about, but if we're talking about the OG of the movement, so Varela himself, I wouldn't say that his view doesn't require inwardness in a way that Jonas's view does. I think with Varela, it's the sort of mind-life continuity thing is very it goes in that direction basically. And for Jonas, when it comes to the role of lived experience in his account, yeah, I think where he does mention it is he explicitly says that the reason we know there is such a thing, and the reason we can understand living beings, he talks about this in the essay after this one, I think it's the third one, then is God a mathematician? I think it's there. So the reason we can understand living beings is because we are living beings. So this circularity is not some kind of a problem, the fact that we as living beings are studying living beings, but rather it's precisely the condition of possibility for the entire discursive enterprise of studying living beings. Because there he talks about the sort of, how to put it, Cartesian or pre-Cartesian mathematical God, who would sort of have a view from nowhere, who would see matter and everything that's going on, physical laws, etc. And he says that we have an advantage over this purely mathematical God, this divine mathematician, precisely because we are living beings and we know what living beings are. So that kind of hypothetical mathematical God wouldn't really have any reason to infer that there is such a thing as subjectivity, as inwardness, as lived experience. So it's precisely because we have it, we can infer it, and we can also understand living beings in a way that we couldn't through a purely physical view. I don't know if that does anything.
Can I say something?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that it might be helpful to separate what Jonas is trying to do in the chapter from his own, his own convictions, his own views. It seems to me that a lot of the chapter is intended to flesh out the implications of Darwinism, and we shouldn't read into his explication of Darwinism the fact that he agrees with what the Darwinian view has done to teleology or to the notion of self, right? So I mean, he's giving us this very rich sort of account of what is it that changes with the advent of Darwinism, right? That the mechanical worldview made no room for discussions of origins, that time wasn't really relevant, and that and that the organisms, because they're so well organized and so complex, were really a serious problem when beginning to consider that question of origins. And that what Darwinism does is give us an account that basically sanitizes that question. It uses the same principles that physics and mechanics are already familiar with, so it's not offensive, right, to the mind, and it can be incorporated. But then what Jonas is doing, I take it in the chapter, is to tease out what are the costs that are paid in this process, right? So what happens to the notion of self? It's reduced, right? As someone else said, compressed to this. There's no formal course of what it means to be alive. It's all just essentially everything is projected to the outside. Everything is explained by the environment and by mutations. You've got simple forces which explain away the sort of previously considered to be intractable complexity of organisms, right? So you've got an account which is mechanistic, which does not assume teleology of any kind, which is in some way sanitized and not metaphysically offensive to any physicist. And then what do we do with that view? What are the advantages that it has, or the advantages it liberates us from this Platonic assumption of essences, and it anticipates in some way many of the existentialist moves. But the cost that we pay is that we don't really have an account of organisms as such, as autonomous beings. There is no autonomy in a neo-Darwinian picture. Notice that he's talking about the connection of Darwinism and genetics. So he's talking about evolutionary theory as it existed at the time that this was written. So you have the modern synthesis view, which essentially eliminates organisms from the picture. The fundamental entities that are of consideration to the biologist are either suborganismic entities like genes. Evolution is even understood as the change in gene frequencies, and populations, right? Because it's populations that evolve, not individuals. So what's really striking is that Jonas is coming from a tradition that is that is used to thinking about the individual organisms as the locus, right? Where questions of populations and variations are always secondary. And he's trying to say how that entire view, what can be saved from it, or what survives it when we take seriously the lessons of Darwinism. Darwinism does succeed in essentially reducing organisms to changes of gene frequencies, and we don't have to reckon with any sort of autonomy. Then, is that a first of all, is it an empirically consistent view, and secondly, is this the view that we want to have of the organism? So for me, this is how I read the chapter, as not necessarily him advocating or defending the Darwinian view, but just fleshing out what the Darwinian view does to more traditional accounts of the organism.
Interesting. And he also ends the chapter with this note of how the materialism kind of collapses on itself if you pull it through, so that the Darwinian view ultimately leads us to re-acknowledge the place of the mind in nature. And then that kind of challenges and almost overturns the assumptions of materialism, which is that everything can be explained in these terms of mechanisms. And to maybe connect that also with Timothy's point of is autonomy enough, the enactive idea of autonomy enough to really bring into picture this inwardness, this subjectivity. I would think that so teleology as we live it can be some kind of supernatural phenomenon, right? It can be something outside the natural forces. So it has to be manifest in the causal unfolding of the body. But I guess it's also not a linear mechanical causal process where, point like a domino effect, one triggering the other. There has to be something broader emerging from the causal structure. So yeah, I get the feeling that we can't really, by studying the organism, you won't find a place where you're like, all right, now subjectivity needs to be introduced. But from the start, we have to reckon with kind of both sides of the equation. And the fact that life has this dual manifestation, or maybe this non-dual manifestation would be better. And I understand this is a complex discussion. So at this point, I'm also just throwing out thoughts without necessarily a clear focal point to them.
It's not a problem. I think it's sort of an appropriate way to approach a book like this one. One other thing that I also found interesting is the connection between evolution and existentialism. Existentialism in the negative sense, she talks about it here, kind of the radical contingency of life, kind of purposelessness. There was also something, how to put it, I mean, it's an interesting sort of connection between two fairly different strata of existence. But I don't know if I have anything really constructive to add on this sort of way that evolution transcends materialism, or rather posits the question again. I think he puts it something like that. But the structure of that is somewhat similar to the structure in the previous essay. Sort of, and again, in some ways reminds me of Merleau-Ponty's modus operandi when it comes to dealing with such issues, sort of materialism overtaking itself, sort of like cartoon style, running off the cliff and not figuring out that it's really not very comfortable in that position anymore. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on any of these many questions that we just raised.
It reminds me. Sorry.
No, I actually wanted to respond to your previous thing, where you so you said that the neo-Darwinian theory focuses only on populations and the genetic level, right? But and also this is kind of connected to what Timothy says before. But natural selection still kind of affects. So you have the germline that is kind of expressed in the embodiment of an organism with everything that it means, and it's obviously not a linear conversion, right? The complexity arises so much, and there are a lot of loops there, feedback loops. But okay, so you get like an organism, and whether the genes of that organism are going to be passed on depends on whether that particular organism is going to reproduce, right? So I think that still an organism still has a valid place within evolutionary theory.
Yeah, I'm not. Well, first of all, this is not the view that I advocate or defend, but it's the view that dominated evolutionary thinking during the second half of the 20th century, and it is a view that organisms are the product of genes on the one hand and environment on the other, and they don't really have agency. There's no room for agency. You don't need it to explain what happens, because you're not looking at what organisms are doing. You're looking at patterns in populations. So you use statistical models, and you don't have to concern yourself with just black boxing the individuals, right? And because the individuals are in essence epiphenomena of their genes, according to this view, right? The gene, the soma is just an expression of the combination of genes and environment. So it's a preformationist and it's a determinist view. So what role do organisms play? Well, not much. Organisms are determined by their genes. If you're very, one extreme, or if not, then organisms are in development a consequence of the interaction between genes and the environment. So sure, yeah, it is organisms that reproduce, but what's happening when they reproduce? They are, according to this view, what the only important or the most important feature of reproduction is the replication of genetic material. You even have a reduction of reproduction to replication, and this is a serious problem, because it turns out that a lot of things happen during reproduction other than gene replication that are important, like epigenetics was mentioned before. But according to the standard view, you don't have to concern yourself with the individual organism at all. You got chance events that may lead some organisms to die, or to before they can mate and reproduce, but there is no room for anything else. And in some ways that's a good thing. It's profitable for the scientists to not have to worry themselves with what organisms want to do, right? To have a theoretical framework that enables you to get answers without thinking about those really tricky questions. And what's happened recently, in the last 20 years, is that it's becoming increasingly clear that this traditional neo-Darwinian view is full of problems. It doesn't hold empirical scrutiny. There are a lot of problems with how it thinks about development, a lot of problems how it thinks about inheritance, a lot of problems about how it thinks about adaptation. But it is that, in some ways, it's still the dominant view. And it was the view, I think, that Jonas was trying to discuss. And, again, not just negatively. Dennett, for example, talks of Darwinism as a universal acid. I think that's something that I was reminded of when reading this. It's almost eliminativist. When you take seriously the logic of Darwinism, you get rid of all kinds of things: Platonic essences, agencies, individual organisms, autonomy, teleology. It's all it all just evaporates. And I think that's why a lot of people find this picture so appealing. Its simplicity and its power, but then at the same time, a lot of people find it very problematic and unappealing for the same reasons.
Now go on and ask what you wanted before I interrupted you with a question.
I was just going to say this thing about the universal acid. I mean, I already mentioned it. You know, that there's a lot of things. Basically, there's no room for them once you take Darwinism seriously. Now, I don't think that we should think that Jonas is agreeing. I don't think he is, but I think he's presenting the picture of philosophical aspects of Darwinism, what Darwinism means for questions that were previously very important, and and then suddenly no longer seem that relevant. There's also this shift. It's not directly discussed in the text of looking at populations rather than individuals. I mean, evolution, the Darwinian evolution, it's a phenomenon that is only relevant or only it exists, or it happens at the level of populations and lineages over long periods of time, right? So again, questions about the individual organism, about intrinsic purposiveness, about its agency, about its selfhood, again, don't seem relevant if you can explain so much by just deriving knowledge of the individual from looking at populations, looking at patterns of frequencies, looking at variation and that kind of thing. It's just a very convenient way of simplifying your work if you're a biologist. It's like reminds me of statistical mechanics, right? I mean, the physicist of the 19th century, who accepts that gases are made of individual particles, would have a massive headache trying to work out how they're going to understand what each individual particle is doing. And there comes statistics to give them a tool to not have to worry about individual particles and to work out, what happens at the microscopic level without having to concern themselves with what individual particles are doing. You're just eliminating that. And this is not a fanciful analogy. I mean, Fisher and some of the evolutionists in the 1930s were very aware of this analogy and they thought that they were transforming biology away from the individual towards the population. And when you do that, you get rid of some questions, just disappear from your view, like this question of autonomy of the individual. I mean, you can infer it, but you are inferring it from looking at populations. You can infer what one zebra does, but what you're doing is looking at lots and lots of zebras over long periods of time. And again, this is something that's come under increasing scrutiny. Evo Devo, which was also mentioned before, is basically a movement that is trying to make the case that if you want to, even to understand evolution itself, you need to consider the individual development, what happens during development. You can't just assume that everything is just genes randomly mutating over time and that's all you need. It might be a really useful idealization for some cases, but it doesn't reflect empirical reality, and we need more complex and more realistic models to understand evolution.
Maybe also, like, this brings to mind, so I don't know how many of you knows Michael Levin, but he talks a lot about the intelligence of cells. So I guess in this way also, development as looked only from the point of the body, so a population of cells, also kind of downplays the input of the kind of autonomy and intelligent behavior of single cells within the body as a whole.
Maybe add to that point, so autonomy shouldn't be constrained to the individual. It can also include these, it can include cells, but I would then add to that it can also include what Merleau-Ponty calls institutions in a broader sense. So there's also the autonomy of, for example, social institutions, and they also work through our body. So it's not only the individual that has a sort of autonomous dynamic, but in a sense, these larger patterns and structures also function and operate through the body and have their agency there. And it seems to me that we should find a way to account for all of that with our theoretical framework. So maybe also a broadening of the idea of autonomy, liberated from the individual in a sense.
I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done in understanding the autonomy of the individual. Don't get me wrong. It's just that Darwinism sidestepped that problem, and it was people actually like Varela, Maturana, and others which were really in the fringes and the margins that did not forget about the problem, right? That no matter how explanatory the Darwinian framework is, we need an account of organization, of biological organization, because as Jonas puts it very nicely in the chapter, all that the Darwinian sort of mechanism can do is it proceeds through elimination, right? Selection disposes of non-fit variants. It doesn't explain the origin of those variants, which may be the question that you're interested in. I mean, if you're interested in the organization of a system, that's a totally different question about the origin of the system. A selective framework is not going to give you much if you assume that variation is only produced through random mutation. You're placing a huge burden on chance to explain the emergence of form. So again, that's one of the things that Ivo Divo has tried to do over the past, since like the 1990s, to provide a theoretical account of the origin of form. An origin of form which is not contradicting the neo-Darwinian picture, but it's basically filling out the details. It's giving us a more rich account of variation, which you can then combine with selection. And what's happened, I mean, just to fill in that picture, ironically, paradoxically, is that it turns out that a lot of variation is not random, and that the individual can actually impact its own, can direct its own development in some ways, and that far from disappearing from view, the individual organism ends up playing a role in its own development, in inheritance, because inheritance is not just genes, right? In reproduction, there's much more than just replication of genes. And in adaptation, because you have genetic assimilation, you have processes by which organisms can change their phenotype, and those changes can then be assimilated genetically, right? And also that it turns out that the gene-soma separation, which it goes back to 1890 to Weismann, is also problematic because the soma is plastic. It's not a predetermined outcome. It's not a foregone conclusion how an organism is going to develop and how it's going to function, but rather organisms have remarkable abilities to adapt and to change, not just in their behavior, but also in their morphology. And that consequently, you can't assume that the morphology of the organism, the form, is determined by its genes. So in any way that you look in contemporary biology, you have threats to this neo-Darwinian view, and the organism is sort of emerging. It's re-emerging, as it were. It's coming back because it needs you can't do biology by abstracting the things that are actually alive, which are organisms. That will only take you so far. I mean, life comes in the form of organisms. They should be the locus of what you look at if you're interested in life. The attempt to idealize the picture, simplify it dramatically by only thinking about patterns of variability over long periods of time, can give us a lot, but it can't give us everything.
Is anyone here maybe familiar with the work of Bergson, creative evolution?
Sorry, yeah, you can't really hear you.
Oh, I was. Is this better?
Yeah.
I was wondering if anyone here is familiar with the work of Bergson, creative evolution. Maybe because I have a feeling that he touches on many of these themes, but I haven't read the book myself. So maybe someone can fill in the keynotes of his insights. No experts here on Bergson.
Yeah, it's one of those things I never really got around to reading. I don't know, maybe there's someone here.
I mean, I did read it a long time ago, but I wouldn't be brave enough to. So much has escaped me that we wouldn't be coherent.
Well, then maybe there's one more concept that was mentioned. I believe it's heavy finality, Merleau-Ponty's concept. Do you happen to remember which text that's from?
So this is in the Institution and Passivity course notes. Page 129. He talks about exactly this issue of he begins by asking if the embryo has a vegetative soul. So this idea of final causality that it's moving towards. And he says then basically with evolution, if we don't believe this, the point isn't to pass to the opposite of pure mechanism, where the creation of a species is imputed to chance. And he continues by saying what there are totalities that are, on the one hand, not a fortuitous gathering of parts, so not a pure contingency, and on the other hand, are also not prior to all causal conditions. And these totalities, he says, are exactly as perception offers them, imperfect and incomplete or less perfect totalities. There is exactly what we see, so Gestalten, and the cosmogony of the perceived world is prospective and retrospective, not finality, but heavy finality, trembling of the whole, teleology by means of the phenomena. So that's the full quote. And what I think is very interesting of this is that he connects this issue of lived teleology with the actual sensuous nature of Gestalt. So the actual presence of perceptual things in the world, that there lies the weight of the teleology we are looking for. And I think that connects also with this issue of you cannot theorize about life by ignoring life. So we need to bring into the equation the dynamic nascent fabric of life and how things play out there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There's something about Merleau-Ponty's style that is just so incredibly recognizable. Beautiful. Yeah, I haven't yet got around to reading that one. So if anyone else has anything to say, feel free to do so.
I may add to that. Actually, I think the later lectures on nature, which are, I think, 1 or 2 years after the lectures on passivity and institution, Merleau-Ponty returns to the problem. He kind of explores this in the second year of those lectures. So I recommend that if you're interested in that question. And I wanted to recommend also the work of contemporary commentator Don Baith, his book from 2018, The Birth of Sense. He exactly discusses this weighted teleology, right? This is an interesting concept. So there are people who are really into this, and it's very interesting. Before, Atul, I think when you were commenting on Merleau-Ponty before, you mentioned the concept of precariousness, and you attributed this to Merleau-Ponty kind of, but I know that actually Jonas is using this in the book, and I think it's in some of the later passages. So I wanted to ask myself, perhaps for those who have already read the whole book, you may know better whether he develops this concept. It's kind of precarious teleology, right? It's not a pure teleology. It's kind of teleology within some material contexts, let's say. So that's something maybe we can look for, in the future, like how this word got, because then Di Paolo is using this, or people who are commenting on Varela, and Di Paolo brought the question of adaptation, or his this famous paper, I think it's from 2006 or something like that, that we need to bring more adaptation into an activist picture and autonomy, etc. So there's kind of link going between all those texts, and it's kind of connected to this weighted theology or the precariousness of the theology. I wanted to connect the things a bit, but of course it creates more chaos maybe. But some of you, if you know the book, I wanted to ask, so maybe some of you would know more about the notion of precariousness. That would be my point, or my question. Because I only know that it's mentioned in the book, but I don't know in what context. I mean, by Jonas.
I think it's the main theme of the next chapter on, the whole idea of the next chapter, which is my favorite of the book, actually, is the idea that organisms are in this, what he calls thermodynamic predicament, where they have to keep doing to keep existing. And the existence is extremely precarious. And I think it's the main theme of this whole picture that he's, basically, for me, it's the most careful and insightful account of metabolism that I've ever read. This chapter that's coming next, he's
Perfect.
Just as he's teasing out the implications of Darwinism in this chapter, he's going to tease out the philosophical implications of metabolism in the next.
Okay, then I have to read that one. Thanks.
I don't know if anyone has any other point about the previous discussion, but I wanted to make a connection again with enactivism. So, well, I was thinking about this when Jonas talks about this idea of the origins as just a simpler state of matter that is done it's in subsequent states, and that this idea of constructive creation as a total series of states in this infinite continuation. And he exemplifies that with Laplace divine calculator. And that for me and many, maybe from other people within enactivism, seems to be still the assumption behind dynamical systems theory, that like you have the equations and then you have all that follows by these equations, like you have the previous state or the initial state, and then you have the variables, and then everything just like you start calculating the next steps. And so for me, there seems to be a tension within enactivism between this enactivist reliance on dynamical system framework as a tool for modeling and understanding behavior, and on the other side, it's the commitment of enactivism with the idea that subjectivity makes a difference in the course of events and in the behavior and in the environment, and this idea of agency. And so I wonder if including subjectivity as a variable, some people have done in the differential equation, somehow will be enough for account for subjectivity. I guess that Jonas will say no, since he also mentions that subjective phenomena defy quantification and also cannot have outward substitutes. So I don't know if enactivism should let go or should find other tools for other than differential equations and this tool from dynamical system theory, or what else. I know Tom Frost is working in this theory of consciousness, like eruption theory of consciousness, to account for that through instability, but I don't know. I would like to hear your ideas about that.
Just one book I'd mention in connection with that. Book from I can't remember exactly when, but definitely, well, of course, at least 20 years ago. Naturalizing Phenomenology. I'm sure that probably most of you are familiar with it, but just in case anyone isn't, it's an interesting book. It's edited by Varela, Petitot, and Roy, if I'm not wrong. And there are different approaches to precisely that question, especially one paper on the neurophenomenology of time consciousness by Varela that I found especially fascinating. But yeah, that's one way of doing it, and it's one way that I would say stays true to Varela's original methodology, which isn't too surprising given that the paper in question is by Varela himself. But there are definitely different enactivist approaches nowadays that sometimes do seem to overlook maybe some of those more some of those methodological concerns that Varela had when it comes to the nature of science and the nature of what it means for living beings to understand living beings. So that's just basically as a comment in case anyone is interested and doesn't know of that book.
Yeah, I would like to add that I see this like this question by Susanna leads back to the question, the relationship between, let's say, the kind of an activist understanding of autonomy on the one side and Jonas's notion of interiority, right? So in the sense, like whether indeed like the activist notion of autonomy could be somehow likened to an outward expression, or let's say a kind of a mechanistic attempt of formulating some sort of view of how we see organisms express their interiority from the outside, right? Then the question is whether the interiority adds another variable, or does it like introduce something new to the dynamics of the behavior of the outward expression of these organisms that you observe, or whether it's just something that, as Adnan said, like that was quite convincing to me, that like Jonas's argument could go in the sense of we have interiority, and so we know life by being living, and so we can ascribe interiority to the systems that exhibit autonomy from the outside, like looking from the outside. So in this sense, you would have a kind of a parallelism, right? Of I mean, interiority would be just a kind of a, let's say, autonomy would be a kind of a outside view of interiority, right? In this sense, you wouldn't need any other variables. And in this sense, I mean, this is like a conception that is most convincing to me, like in the sense that there's nothing missing from the dynamical systems account. It's just a different perspective on the same phenomenon, which you would describe by talking about interiority. Or the alternative would be something is missing, something is being reduced from the framework of dynamical systems. So yes, I guess my question to you all would be what you make of this, or how you see Jonas in this regard.
Well, I don't think the autonomy for activists can be just ascribed. That's something you said. I think that there is a fundamental difference there, that they would refuse. This is just something ascribed, as in the Kantian view. So, but I'm no an activist, so I don't know. But I would clear, like the last paper, Weber and Varela, right? They are discussing Kantian position, and there the wholeness of the organism is kind of ascribed, is something kind of due to the observer, let's say. But as I understand an activism, like they have a realist stance, right? They want to claim that the whole is a real whole, right? It's not ascribed. Just a comment, because you used the word that it's ascribed, right? So I think.
Yeah. Maybe it was the wrong word, but yeah, I didn't want to say ascribed as in the as if sense of Kant, let's say, but in the sense that you're being realist about it. So you're saying, I cannot see the interiority of another organism directly, but I know it's there because I make this inference from it exhibiting autonomy, let's say.
So it's kind of both realist description or realist description, right? So it's both real and perceived.
Maybe a way of putting that is that it's different levels of description. So you've got a lower level of description. Think again of the example of the gases. You can describe a flask with gases looking at individual particles. You can also describe it in terms of statistical regularities. They're both real in some sense. One is not being projected onto the system, but they just fulfill different needs, epistemic needs. So similarly, you may want to say the same thing about the organization of an organism. You can explain it in terms of molecular reactions. That can be helpful for some projects, but you may want to describe it in ways that that go beyond that lower level of description. And I'm that doesn't need to be a sort of phenomenological move of saying I can only see it because I only recognize it because I am one. I am also. So you can still try to keep it within a naturalistic framework and say, this is still a sort of scientific explanation, an objective explanation. It's just an explanation that is couched in different terms. It's a different level of description.
Yeah,
go ahead. Okay, well, I just had a couple of thoughts on that. One is, I think I agree it's different levels of description, but at the same time, I think there's a need to, at least from my own phenomenological viewpoint, there's a need to recognize the primacy of the living substance there, so that they're not equivalent entirely, even though there are different levels of describing the same. I would say the description of the lived behavior gets to a more ontologically primitive level of what's happening. And the description from the outside of the organism presupposes a perceiver that studies it and that examines it and then expresses that. So that would be one reflection. Yeah, I think I'll drop with that. I'll think about the rest of what I wanted to say.
Why is it more primary?
Well, I would go there in line with reflections of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty of the primacy of taking experience as primary, as the lived as primary, and seeing how science itself is founded on activities of a perceiving human being, and how it brings forth, bodies of meaning that we enact and that then reshape our perception. So basically, I would adopt a broad existential view on science. Science itself is something we enact. So scientific knowledge and the description from the outside as a founded phenomenon, in that sense, as a founded on a primary life of the organism.
One very brief comment I'd make is just regarding the bit that I quoted from Jonas, rather paraphrased, that we can understand life because we are life. I don't think it's just merely the matter of essentially an argument from analogy that I don't think Jonas is doing that. He's not. I don't think he's saying that we have these inside states and that's sort of an extra bit of information that we have, and because of that we can use analogy to infer that other living beings have something similar as well. I think it goes deeper than that. Again, having read only one chapter ahead, I think I can't say much on that, but I do think that it would be somewhat misleading to say it's just a matter of an analogy, because in some sense, it's not just that we need lived experience in order to ascribe lived experience to other living beings, but rather we can only have a notion of something like life, of something like living being, because we are living beings. So I think that this is going out on a limb to some extent, but I think Jonas would say that it would be very strange to talk even about knowledge in the case of that hypothetical pure mathematician God that he's talking about in the next chapter. It's I think maybe he would even make the point that it's hard to see how that kind of a pure mathematician could know life, or maybe by extension anything, in the sense in which we know things, which is a bit more of a radical move.
Connecting with that, so it's not a mere analogy, and also the previous point of Timothy that the ascription is not a sort of a projection, the ascription of autonomy. So I feel like there's a similar point being made there, and it makes me think of Merleau-Ponty's notion of Einfühlung, of that perception is this German word Einfühlung. So you feel yourself one with what you perceive, and so when I look at another living being, I don't analogize my own interiority to it. I don't ascribe it, but I feel myself, I feel something like me present over there. And it's a pre-reflective process, right? It's before we start thinking and analogizing, there's already a sort of my perception is permeated by the vital energy of this being there, before I do anything to ascribe that. But so I guess that's one thing. So it's deeper than the intellectual level, this similarity, this kinship that we feel. But at the same time, there is uncertainty there, right? There's ambiguity, and we can't be sure. So it's like I feel like we should take into account that uncertainty. Like we have a sense that the other living beings have an interiority, but there's also uncertainty how solid we can be about that and where to draw the line. Like, does it go all the way down? And Hans Jonas kind of, I feel like he kind of like skates over the point and just says it has to be at the beginning of life. But I feel like that's an open empirical question. Like, when does the interiority emerge? Is it the beginning of life? Is it the beginning of some kind of sensory motor autonomy? Or, where in the line does it happen? Yeah, so it feels like there's an open question there, an open empirical question about yeah, whether another organism has this inwardness or not.
I think that's one thing that is sort of to the credit of evolution, that it becomes hard to certainly it becomes pretty much impossible to draw that line at the same point where Descartes drew it, when we have the notion of evolution. But I don't know, I think given that how elementary inwardness is in Jonas's view, I don't think it's that hard to follow him in that conclusion that it has to be at the beginning of life. And I think yeah, inwardness here isn't anything very anything terribly complex, and in some ways it's I read it at least similarly to the basic sort of Varelian view of life, of cognition in some sense being a fundamental aspect of life itself.
Yeah, that's a good connection. Thank you for that one. I didn't think of it. I wanted to add to, again, the Merleau-Ponty, and because Atul mentioned empathy, which actually was kind of analogical in Husserl, right? So empathy or Einfühlung, that's where Merleau-Ponty takes it from Husserl. So actually, it would be maybe more complicated with whether it's analogy or not. But I wanted to add that Merleau-Ponty says at one point that biology is based or presupposes our capacity for empathy, which is something like what Jonas says with this life can only be known by life. So biologists, they need to, be alive to study those organisms or the wholes. That's I think an interesting connection as well with what Adnan was mentioning from Jonas. Just to connect a little bit the dots again.
I think there, I think it's possible, at least plausible, to go even a step further, to say that empathy is, in a sense, necessary not only for biology. If we, of course, by empathy we understand this sort of pre-reflective thing that it is in Merleau-Ponty. It's not only necessary for biology; it's necessary for science as such, or rather, to take it a step further, it's in a sense, in Merleau-Ponty, it might be necessary for perception as such, because perception is, and that's one of the really fascinating bits in phenomenology of perception. I think at least that's one way of reading him, that our perception of the world sort of presupposes that it is sort of crisscrossed by multiple possible perspectives in a way that can't just be accounted for by sort of a single monadic subject doing sort of if-then calculations in his mind to sort of get those other potential perspectives, if that makes sense. I think that's at least sort of a somewhat possible position when it comes to Merleau-Ponty.
I just add a point about empathy, because it kind of raised an idea to me. We tend to treat it in this modern sense as something that we do, and it's kind of thought about as like some cognitive thing that we do. We try to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. But what if empathy is the primary state? It's the, I had a good phrase earlier on, but it kind of escaped my mind now. Life is primarily empathetic. It lives itself in its environment. And if we look at animals, this is very, very much, it comes to the front because they're really connected with the environment, even more so with, say, plants. But then in humans, you have this process of trying to subtract ourselves from the world and trying to de-empathize ourselves from the environment which we used to be more connected with. And I think that's that's kind of related to what we're talking about. The reason we find everything to be kind of, I think in the previous chapter he talks about this pan-vitalism, that we experience everything as living. It's because we are kind of empathized with the whole of creation or whatever, and then we cognitively try to make this empirical research. So are we really in everything that's around us, and try to make this separation between ourselves, which ultimately leads to the Cartesian dichotomy, and which then leads us back towards trying to connect ourselves with the world that we kind of willfully divorce ourselves from. So yeah, life is primarily empathetic.
That's a very good point, I think. Thank you for that. And I think it also gives an answer, or at least outlines the answer with regards the status of the inwardness, right? Or the like whether this quality of living is something internal or inside. And now, if we connect it with this pan-vitalism, I don't see it as anything, kind of enclosed within us. It's actually very much in the environment, I would say, or very much outside. So I really like this way of reading Jonas. Perhaps there would be different ways, but
I'm not sure what he himself thinks, because he uses kind of strange, like in the pan-vitalism bit, he uses the term inference, that this vitality of the surroundings is an inference. But later on, I think he tries to say as though it's the primary state, and then the inference is actually the subtraction of subjectivity and the human from the environment. So I'm not sure, at this point I don't think it's clear exactly what this means.
We'll see.
I don't know if the fact that a decent proportion of us here are fairly familiar with Merleau-Ponty and the inactivists, Plessner, I don't know if that helps with our reading of this text, or if it just irreparably skews our reading of Jonas. I think in any sense, in any case, it's a text that can use a bit of skewing in a way, because it's methodologically a bit sometimes not very clear. It's not very sort of systematic in terms of his methodology. And also in the previous chapter, when he's talking about experience, and he sort of seems to be jumping between a first person and third person approach to experience, and it's not really clear what does it boil down to. So yeah, just as a comment, I don't know if it helps or if it really colors everything, but I suppose this kind of a text has to be colored in some way, in any case, given its lack of clarity in some ways.
I'd say it helps in the sense that we can see that all these different thinkers coming from kind of different environments went through the very similar steps on their journey to try to understand either life or cognition. And so it's almost funny, because Plessner goes through the same succession of starting with this sketch of the current state of affairs, and then he has to first deal with the Cartesian dichotomy, which kind of prevents us from being able to move forward. And I think it's good to appreciate this horizon, which hasn't changed that much, has it? Like, even despite these specific empirical advancements, and there are, as Dan and Ela have said, there are different ideas around now that are being seriously tested. But the basic horizon, which we seem to enter into when we start doing science, seems to be pretty similar in the fundamental makeup of these Cartesian assumptions, which only get questioned in more advanced forms of science when you're really trying to get to the nitty-gritty, or when you're dealing with theoretical science. So yeah, this horizon, I think it's good to keep it in mind, but I'm not sure if all the comparison between the different thinkers help to illuminate them, or they just put together a lot of different stuff which might not be completely compatible. For example, with Plessner is examining the exact same things, has very similar ideas about how to deal with these problems, But all along, he is dealing with a very specific way of looking at life, which is through intuition, which we've mentioned before. He's really treating the phenomenon, not the phenomenon as some kind of objective thing out there in the world, but as a phenomenon which gives itself to us. And that's his very specific implications. And he also comes to similar conclusions like life knows life. That's actually a formulation which is found in Plessner. And I'm pretty sure Jonas had to have something to do with Plessner, and he never acknowledged it. But yeah, he actually has a different framework which he's working with. And Jonas might seem to be doing the same thing, but he's operating on different levels and with a different methodology, which is not quite clear, as you've said, Adnan.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in some ways, I think this is something that we talked about, on our first meeting of this cycle. There's something of value with texts that aren't methodologically too rigorous. I suppose precisely because of that, they sort of make one uncomfortable methodologically. You don't really know where you are with this, and sort of helps you question certain methodological assumptions that you have. So I say in that sense, it's that's definitely one aspect of usefulness in having something somewhat less than perfectly rigorous. But yeah, there's many different ways. I definitely agree completely with that sort of view, that there's a very similar conceptual gestalt switch happening with these different authors that we are interested in. But yeah, maybe they're sort of, all of them are challenging in different ways. Because Merleau-Ponty, I wouldn't say that he's methodologically challenging in the sense that, I mean, he's my impression always was that he's very, very rigorous in terms of that. But the way he writes is just it's sort of very, very, I mean, he has those sort of beautiful poetic paragraphs that are just, you can just read and reread, and just absolutely fascinatingly beautiful. And then at some point you're reading and like you're 2 pages into an argument and you don't know if is that his position, is that that guy that he never explicitly names but that he's criticizing here, or so yeah, many different ways to torture ourselves intellectually. Marvelous.
I have like one small note on this discussion we had on empathy and on your point of that, that life is primarily empathetic in its relation to the world. Just to circle back on this point. So I also think I agree with this, but I feel it's important to also, so empathy feels here to have a notion of contact, like life is in contact with life, and that's how it knows the rest of life. But I feel like what Merleau-Ponty also emphasizes is that there's a distance in the contact and a contact in the distance, so that we are empathetic, we perceive life empathetically, but through uncertainty and through a sort of density of not knowing. So, for example, if I see a person in coma, I can't empathetically know whether they are experiencing something or not. So empathy isn't like a sixth sense that penetrates beyond our senses into the mind of another. It is through the senses that it is in communication with another being, a transcendent being. So that, yeah, there's a distance and an uncertainty there, and that seems to me to confirm that the question of whether, where the inwardness began, that is an open question. As far as I can tell, we can't say from the start what has this inwardness and in what way. Like, does it extend to plants? Does it extend to mycelium? Does it extend to stars? And the whole question of panpsychism opens up there, of like Jonas draws the line at the beginning of life, but the transition between the inorganic and the organic is also not discrete. So why not pull it further than that? And to me, that the uncertainty itself is just a philosophically significant point, the point that we have to deal with this not knowing and this ambiguity.
But isn't in this sense like the Varelian notion of an identity coming forth from like even from a cell as like a sort of autonomous being kind of points into the direction where Jonas is going, which like places inwardedness at the beginning of life, or at least at the beginning of the first cell. So I mean that we have some sort of a conceptualization, at least in activism, of why a cell has an inwardedness in a way, if it's similar to an identity, and why a rock doesn't, right?
We can't hear you that well.
I was just saying, I think the enactive approach does solid work in building that case for an inwardness from a cellular level onwards. But I'm not entirely convinced that it establishes that point in stone. Like it's working with the evidence and trying to construct a model to show how a cell could have inwardness. But there's a lot of like lines drawn between in and out that are, I think, still speculative. I'm not sure if we can really do rigorous empirical work there and really establish it. But I do agree that the enactive approach is exactly moving in that direction.
I'll just mention, because I recently read some of the recent enactivist approaches, like ones from Thompson, Di Paolo, Giovanna Colombetti, and such, where these authors all seem to be in agreement that I mean they are very reluctant on basing let's say arguments about phenomena possessing inwardness, or let's say consciousness, on the basis of the let's say argument from analogy, from let's say notions of autonomy. Like I think, as I remember specifically, when Giovanna Colombetti somewhere says that she understands this more in a sense that every form of life possesses a kind of autonomous inwardness, but this doesn't really necessarily result in consciousness. Like the question where you place consciousness in the physical world is still open. Like she says that the enactive, like said, point should be limited to saying that the inwardness of autonomous systems has something essential to say about how consciousness, or let's say mindedness, is structured in living beings, but that isn't to say that every autonomous system do possess consciousness. Like that doesn't really like it's a very speculative point for most of the recent authors, and I'm not sure what my opinion here is, but yeah, I would be inclined more on this on the cautious side.
Just one comment that relates to this question, and also the question of panpsychism. Jonas, in the bit that I've read so far, doesn't mention panpsychism as such, but I mean, he does, but in a completely different sense in the first essay. But in the second appendix to the third essay, I suppose, yeah, he talks about Whitehead, and the bit that's interesting here is his sort of criticism. Whitehead, rather some aspects that he doesn't really want to go along with. Here's just a very brief quote of what Whitehead's philosophy results in for Jonas. The result is a submersion of discontinuity where it matters, between life and non-life, against its injection where it is hypothetical, between phases of physical duration. See, the second part isn't really relevant for us here, but just as a comment, Jonas does seem to take a stand on the panpsychism issue, or rather on the issue of where we draw the line of inwardness and life. And yeah, he does seem to be clear that there has to be a line in some sense, because of course, if you accept panpsychism, you get rid of the problem of the line, because there is no line. Everything is on this side, on the living side of that line. But yeah, it's
also sorry, Adnan. Did you? Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Also, I would add that, yeah, I was thinking just now, I mean, the notion of inwardness doesn't necessarily have to imply any sort of. I mean, I'm not sure how Jonas would connect this with notions such as phenomenal consciousness or anything like that. I mean, you could also read Jonas as saying, like, I mean, inwardness as being a kind of special quality of subjective experience, like a kind of a specific, like, let's say, gestalt of subjective experience, but not the only kind. Like, I'm not really sure what he would say on this point. Like, he could be, his position could be seen as kind of like compatible with panpsychism in that sense, like inwardness being just a kind of specific shaping of let's say, subjective experience.
I didn't get that impression. I got the impression that with inwardness, he just wants a very wide term to describe all kinds of possible inward experiences which are not accessible to us as observers. So I think it's the meta term for all kinds of different forms of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, whatever. It's a very similar use to what Plessner uses, which is interiority. He's not trying to specify it, but we are kind of assuming, given the conclusions of the Cartesian dichotomy, that other beings have some kind of thing on the inside of them that isn't material, and that is just the general term to try to capture that without trying to specify it. And I think he's not specifying with good reason, because he's trying to start from to derive consciousness as we. I mean, I don't know if he's going to try to be doing that, but to try to understand consciousness in this more primary sense, rather than trying to start from the human level where we all already have some kind of very specific expectation of what consciousness is, to really narrow it down, or not narrow it, widen it in a very wide sense. Yeah, I think it's a wide term. It's the meta term for all kinds of inward phenomena which we assume other beings have, that we know we have, but we are not specifying at this point.
I just have a couple brief comments here. The first one, maybe the expression inwardness, and by the way, yeah, I got the exact same impression as you did. So yeah, that it's sort of a very broad term that could be, I don't know what other option there would be to express what he means. Maybe in some sense feeling, but feeling can have different connotations, but something very rudimentary, something that's absolutely elementary to life itself. But I would say that in that sense, maybe it's not the best possible word to use, because it seems that insofar as we're talking about inwardness, that seems to have some kind of a specific epistemological structure that seems to be implied. There seems to be some kind of a subject-object structure that's, I would say, not really necessary at that level. And especially if we think about more rudimentary forms of consciousness, it's really, it seems like we absolutely have to assume that those would be very much immersed in the world, so to speak, because also with our own lived experience, we are immersed more or less completely most of the time. What is strange is precisely this fact that we can then have reflection. We can we have a more abstract way of viewing things. Then we can think about ourselves and do all sorts of weird things. But the default mode is sort of complete immersion, in a sense, in the environment. And in that way, in that sense, inwardness seems to be somewhat misleading, because you'd assume that, like, if you accept that inwardness is universal to life, that it is elementary for life, you'd assume that an ant would be pretty immersed in its life world. In a way, inwardness does not sound like the best way of describing it, because it sort of seems to contrast it with an outwardness, with an outside. But okay, that's just one sort of comment. Another one is that when it comes to this issue, which is always a very interesting thing to talk about, a very sort of thorny issue of where we draw the line with consciousness. Is it just human beings? Is it higher mammals? Is it mammals? Is it cells, or is it just everything? There's a fascinating difference of intuitions here. Here I'm just talking about sort of basic intuitions that we all have coming to philosophy. Sort of our primary intuitions, I would say, do seem to be somewhat different. And one way that they're different might be that some people tend to think of consciousness in a bit more of a all or nothing sort of way, that consciousness is essentially a binary quality. And in that sense, it's, of course, in some sense, it has to be binary. There has to be something that's conscious and something that's not conscious, unless you're a panpsychist. But it seems tempting to understand consciousness too narrowly proceeding from our own lived experience. And then, of course, it seems wildly implausible to ascribe it to anything else, let alone to an amoeba or a quark, for that matter. But if we take consciousness as something that has degrees, that has levels, and I don't know, I think probably all of us have had experiences which are sort of incredibly simple, in a sense, not really full-blown reflective abstract thought. So in that sense, maybe we all I don't know, to some extent can understand what it would be like to be a sort of simpler conscious being. But yeah, if anyone, just by the way, if anyone is interested in panpsychism, one really fascinating author that I wouldn't say that I agree with that much, but that I find just incredibly fascinating is Galen Strawson, in that sense. He's an analytic philosopher, but he's one that really engages in dialogue with Zahavi and with some of the people in phenomenological camp a lot. So if anyone's if anyone is interested in panpsychism, that would definitely be one place to look. But yeah, maybe that's straying a bit too far here.
Let me just challenge this Primož's interpretation a bit on how Jonas understands inwardness, and maybe this is something that's not really I don't remember clearly, but I think that Jonas at some point defined inwardness in a sort of kind of a Heideggerian sense, in which there seems to be there's some sort of reflexivity going on, but it is a kind of existential, or let's say precognitive, let's say, reflexivity, where the being having this interiority is somehow interested in its own survival, or it's like its own mode of being. It has some sort of internal relatedness, in the sense that it's striving to maintain or develop its own way of existence. And I'm not really sure whether he says this, but in this sense, this is my the reading of the notion of the interiority that has accompanied my reading so far. So as a kind of not only of saying like this is a sort of category of different unrelated kind of mental phenomena, but also a kind of notion that somehow encompasses also the structure of the let's say mode of experience that a being has. So yeah, that would be a question, like whether anybody else has a similar understanding of.
I would kind of say that inwardness is what we as observers are assuming in other beings. But what you're describing, which I don't know about, could be the condition that needs to be present in a certain thing for this kind of inwardness to actually be objective, to actually exist. Whereas inwardness is basically the way we tend to perceive certain things, or in the case of pan-vitalism, all things, as having this either vitality or having this these conscious qualities of this, not conscious qualities, but an interior world which is not accessible to us. But I think what you're describing could be the actual describing of the objective conditions necessary for something like that to be the case.
I think that the way you two are describing inwardness, I think those two ways would be, in terms of extension, would be identical. And in Jonas's view, if we do one way or another identify it with purpose, then yeah, it's still, I think that makes sense. And insofar as purposiveness is inherent in life, it seems to define life, and that's also something that he gets into when he talks about metabolism in the next essay, then yeah, it might be a different way of, it's actually a pretty good way of understanding inwardness, but it still would have to be universal for life as such, if I'm correct there. Oh, so Timothy, I don't know if that was, if you were trying to criticize the position that it's universal in life, or just the way of understanding it.
No, just the way of understanding understanding how Jonas uses the concept of endurity, whether it's just a category noting, like an extensive category, you could say, just denoting all the different types of phenomena that we experience inwardly, or whether it's a kind of structure of experience, like as I've described. Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course, I understand. Thank you.
As far as I can tell, Timothy's conception of inwardness involves recursiveness, so circularity, sort of a feeding back onto itself. That makes it not just an inwardness, but a sort of a light, where it's also experiencing its own inwardness. Well, I have a feeling like that if we consider inwardness more broadly, which is maybe what Primož is suggesting, that maybe it doesn't need to have this recursiveness even. That maybe some phenomena in nature have inwardness without it feeding back onto itself, a sort of blind inwardness. An inwardness that is not self-conscious or conscious or aware, but simply has an inner life without ever being aware that it has an inner life. So it seems it seems there's a distinction between inwardness in the broad sense and this circular inwardness, which Timothy is pointing out.
And what Plessner says is that this more primary interiority, which is present even to a certain sense in plants, is, but at that point he doesn't call it consciousness, but at the point of animals, he thinks it's sufficient to talk about consciousness. There's no difference. Having an interior life and being conscious, why should there be a difference in these two things? The other thing is self-consciousness. That's reserved for the more advanced primates. So yeah, I like this point. But maybe regarding what Adnan said earlier, this idea of this continuity of consciousness, how far do we go? What things are conscious? What things have some kind of interiority? I think ultimately you do end up at a certain point where it has to be a switch, because I like we mentioned reflexivity. At a certain point, a body, however we think, or a thing, comes into this state where it is start to be given to itself. I think like this could be a very not basic, but a way of describing this, the most basic understanding of what consciousness ultimately becomes. So I think at some point you get to the binary switch, and but I don't know about white hats to know where that point is.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with that, definitely. There does have to be a switch. My point was just that, how to put it? Well, of course, we get to a point where there is no consciousness, but when it comes to beings that do have consciousness, there is a huge amount of variation there. There are a lot of levels there. So that was the only point I was making. But yeah, I do definitely agree that it does have to be a switch. Again, unless you're Galen Strawson, in that case, you wouldn't say that there is a switch, because you wouldn't say that there is such a thing as non-conscious matter. Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions, maybe comments related to this here or something else?
Maybe something else.
Sure.
More like a general note on the structure of the text. I think it was in the beginning of the previous essay we discussed, where he has this idea that, how shall you say it? His question is basically, why is life, either phenomenologically or biologically, whatever, why is it even a problem for us? And he's writing this history of how, for example, for Descartes, why does he look at everything as extension, and does he exclude this notion of interiority in the animal, for example? It's because for him, or at least in the previous epoch, life as a lived experience wasn't as much as a problem, you know? Science was filled with notions of soul and powers and what have you. And so he couldn't think extension or matter as such, which was his problem. And so he made this new science of body, well, not just him, but the entire period. And then after a while, because we're so used to this purely scientific material reductionist way of thinking, eventually life as something interior becomes again a problem for us, because we can no longer think it anymore. Huh? And he's sort of writing this history, and it's just a general note, but I think it's important to keep in mind, because at the very beginning of the first essay, I think, or an introduction or whatever, I think he mentions how, like, he imagines like the most primitive man or primordial experience of life, in which life isn't even a problem, but the real problem is death. Huh? And why is life a problem for us? And I think it's important just to keep this general question of his in mind. Yeah.
I think that's a useful way of setting.
Yeah. So I just want to say that maybe it's also important for the previous topic, for example, that I do think that he, at least up till now, he's using quite a general notion of, for example, this interior life or whatever, because he wants to sketch this quite broad history and apply the concept of life, how it functions in various different philosophies, from Darwinism to Descartes to.
Yeah, it's definitely the appropriate sort of reference frame to have in mind when reading this book. Had a couple, had sort of a half-formed thought on that topic, but I think it probably went the way of all impermanent things. Okay, so does anyone else have anything to add? Or else we can maybe wrap this up. Okay, so in that case, we can call it a day here. Thank you all, and we'll have our next meeting in 2 weeks. Of course, once again, a very warm invitation to those of you that haven't yet had any presentations to sign up for one of them. You have the link to the spreadsheet in the email. So yeah, just feel free to write your name next to the essay that you find most interesting. Okay, so yeah, that's it for today, and thank you, and see you in 2 weeks.